Most people spend their entire lives believing one thing above all others: that if they try hard enough, if they plan carefully enough, if they hold on tightly enough, life will eventually cooperate. So they hold, they plan, they push, they stay up late arranging the variables. They send the message again. They adjust the strategy one more time. They find a new angle on the same problem that has not moved in months. And the more they do this, the heavier everything becomes, as if life itself were quietly resisting them, not angrily, not dramatically, simply with the patient weight of something that refuses to be forced. Carl Jung watched this pattern for decades. What he observed was not a personal weakness. He saw it as something far more fundamental. A deep misunderstanding about where the actual guidance of a life comes from. Beneath the ego. The part of us that plans and controls and insists. There exists a deeper current, one that Jung called the self, and that many spiritual traditions call God. That current has its own direction, its own timing, its own language, and it does not cooperate with force. In this video, we will explore what happens when we finally stop forcing, and what begins to move in our lives, in our energy, in our sense of direction when we learn to trust what has been guiding us all along. Perhaps by the end, you will look at what is happening in your life right now in an entirely different way. There is a very familiar belief in the way most people approach their lives, that when things are not going the way they should, we must do something. Immediately, forcefully. We try to hold on to a relationship that is slipping. We try to force a career path that has stopped feeling alive. We try to make life unfold according to a specific shape we decided it must take. And the logic behind this seems entirely reasonable. Effort produces results. Control prevents loss. Action is what responsible adults do. But Carl Jung noticed something that most of us miss entirely in the middle of all that doing. He observed that the human psyche, what he mapped over a lifetime of clinical work and inner exploration, does not operate like a machine that responds to effort. It operates more like a river. It has its own current, its own direction, and when we try to force it against that current, the energy does not simply increase, it begins to drain. Jung called the deeper center of the psyche the self. Not the self in the ordinary sense, not the personality we show the world or the identity we have constructed over years of choices and accommodations, but something older, quieter, more fundamental, something that many spiritual traditions across centuries have called, with varying words, the same thing: God, or divine guidance, or the deeper wisdom that operates in the spaces the ego cannot reach. And one of the things Jung was most insistent about across decades of work and writing is that this deeper current cannot be forced. It can only be listened to. And when it is ignored long enough, life begins to send signals that become increasingly difficult to dismiss. This video is an invitation to consider one question. Not, how do I try harder? But, what if the wisest thing I can do right now is to stop forcing and allow something deeper than my own plans to guide what comes next? Jung spent a lifetime studying what happens to people who never learn to ask that question, and what becomes available to those who finally do. We will walk through that together tonight, beginning with what the ego actually does when it mistakes control for safety. Moving through what happens in the body and the energy when the soul has stopped cooperating with the direction being forced. Through the signals that arrive quietly at first, then louder from the deeper psyche. Through what it means when life removes something we were not ready to release. through the strange and specific way that meaningful guidance begins to arrive when forcing finally stops. And ending where Jung believed the only real peace is ever found. Not in having arranged everything correctly, but in the quiet that opens when we stop being so certain we know better than the current that was here before us. Chapter 1. The illusion of control. Most of us were never told that this is a pattern. We were only told that it was responsible. When there is a problem, act. When things are uncertain, plan. When someone or something seems to be slipping away, hold tighter. Work harder. Stay more vigilant. And if none of that works, try all of it again with more determination. And for a time, this approach carries us. It produces results. It keeps things from falling apart. It gives the ego the one thing it values above everything else: the feeling of being in control. Carl Jung observed this tendency with what we might call compassionate precision. He did not call people who force their lives foolish or weak. He understood that the impulse to control comes from a very real need. The ego, the part of the psyche that faces the external world, makes decisions, and manages daily life experiences uncertainty as a threat, and it responds to threats the only way it knows how. More effort, more management, more force. Jung once wrote something that is worth holding carefully. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. He was not being harsh, he was being precise. Because what the constant activity of controlling and forcing very often prevents is exactly this: a moment of genuine stillness, long enough to hear what the deeper self is actually saying, to feel which direction the current is actually moving, to recognize that the heaviness building inside is not a sign that more effort is needed. It is a sign that the effort has been moving in the wrong direction for longer than we have been willing to admit. Jung borrowed a concept from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus to name this phenomenon. He called it enantiodromia. The principle that any force pushed to its extreme eventually begins to generate its own opposite. The river pressed too tightly between narrowed banks does not flow faster, it becomes turbulent. The string wound too tightly does not hold more, it breaks. And the person who grips most tightly in an effort to feel secure is very often the one living with the least genuine sense of safety. Because the grip itself becomes the generator of the anxiety it was meant to prevent. Think about a fistful of dry sand held as tightly as possible. The pressure meant to secure it is the very force that drives it through the gaps between the fingers. The tighter the grip, the faster the loss. And the only way to hold what you are trying to hold is to open the hand. But here is what most people do not anticipate. The first moment the hand opens, the first genuine moment of releasing the grip, does not feel like relief. It feels like falling. The ego, which has organized itself entirely around the effort of holding, experiences the absence of that effort, not as freedom but as danger. The stillness feels wrong, unfamiliar in a way that mimics the feeling of something going wrong. And most people, in that first moment of quiet, reach immediately for something new to hold, because the alternative, the actual empty-handed stillness, feels like a kind of exposure the ego has never learned to tolerate. This is why so many people cycle through the same pattern without ever truly breaking it. They release briefly, feel the disorientation, and grip again often something different, but with the same underlying urgency, because nobody told them that what comes after the first uncomfortable stillness, if they can stay in it long enough to let it settle. is not emptiness. It is the first faint movement of the current they had been blocking with their hands. Chapter 2. When the soul withdraws its energy. When the ego is forcing life in a direction the soul has already left, the first thing that disappears is not opportunity. It is energy, not the dramatic collapse of a person who has clearly broken down. Something far more subtle, and in many ways more disorienting because it arrives without a clear cause. The work is the same. The responsibilities are the same. The routine that once felt sustainable now feels like something you are carrying rather than something you are doing. Jung described psychic energy, what he called libido, in the broadest sense, as something that flows naturally toward what the self recognizes as genuinely aligned with a person's development, and that withdraws, quietly, persistently, when it does not. He expressed this through a sentence that contains more than it first appears to. Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. What he was pointing at is a distinction most people have felt, but never quite named. There is a quality of doing something when it genuinely belongs to you, when the energy appears without being summoned, when the beginning of the day finds you rather than you dragging yourself toward it. And then there is the quality of doing something through willpower alone, when every morning requires a small act of force just to continue. These are not different amounts of the same experience. They are different things entirely. And the confusion between them, the belief that the second can be corrected by more effort, is one of the most common sources of sustained inner exhaustion that Jung observed in the people who came to him. A woman named Margaret had taught music for 19 years. For the first 12, she described it as the most natural thing in the world. The energy was simply there. She did not need to manufacture enthusiasm. The students arrived. The music happened. Something in the exchange was alive. And then, gradually, it stopped being alive. Not because the students changed, not because the school changed, not because anything visible changed. The external circumstances were nearly identical. But the quality of what she brought to the room each morning, that intangible aliveness, had gone somewhere. She spent 3 years trying to recover it through effort. More lesson planning, more professional development, more conscious attempts to reconnect with what she once loved. None of it restored what had left. What she described, finally looking back on that period from a distance, was not a failure of commitment. It was a realization she had resisted for 3 years because it required a change she was not ready to make. The energy had not disappeared. It had moved. Quietly, without announcement, it had shifted toward something she had been putting aside for years, a different form of work with music that she had always told herself was impractical. The withdrawal of energy from the old direction was not the problem. It was the signal that something truer was waiting for the space to become available. Jung understood this pattern clearly. In the context of what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, the withdrawal of energy is not a crisis. It is a correction, a quiet redirection, as if something that sees further than the ego, something that many people experience as the guidance of God, is gently closing one channel so that another can open. The question worth sitting with is not, how do I get the energy back? It is simpler and more honest than that. Where is the energy still alive? Because somewhere often in a direction the ego finds inconvenient or impractical, the current is still moving. And in that living current, however small, the deeper direction of the soul is already speaking. Chapter 3. The Signals. You were never taught to read. Before life changes direction in a significant way, it almost always sends smaller signals first. They are easy to miss. Not because they are subtle, though they often are, but because the ego has learned to immediately classify them as something manageable and move on. A persistent feeling of flatness before a meeting you have attended hundreds of times. A brief emptiness after an evening that by every external measure should have felt satisfying. A recurring sense arriving in the same quiet moments, again and again, that something is not quite right about the direction things are going. The ego's response to these signals is almost always immediate and almost always the same. Tired, stressed, just a phase. Everyone feels this way sometimes. And it continues. Back to the plan, back to the effort, back to the management of outcomes that are becoming increasingly resistant to being managed. Jung wrote one of his most frequently quoted sentences with this pattern in mind. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What he meant was not that people are victims of hidden psychological forces. He meant that the unconscious does not stop communicating simply because the conscious mind has decided not to listen. The signals do not disappear when they are dismissed. They amplify. What begins as a quiet feeling of unease becomes persistent fatigue. What begins as persistent fatigue becomes physical. What begins as physical eventually grows into something the ego can no longer classify as a phase, a crisis, a collapse, an ending that arrives with the quality of inevitability, as if it had been building for a long time. Because it had been. The unconscious speaks in many languages, but the first language it uses before the feelings become clear, before the signals become undeniable, is the body. A tightening in the chest that appears whenever a particular subject comes up. A heaviness in the mornings that lifts on certain days and not others. The way appetite changes. The way sleep becomes restless in a way that does not correspond to any obvious external cause. The body registering something the conscious mind has not yet given itself permission to acknowledge. This is not metaphor. The body keeps a precise and honest record of what the mind is working very hard not to know. Most people have learned to explain these physical sensations away as efficiently as they explain away the emotional ones. Stress, age, not getting enough exercise, and they continue past the tightening, past the heaviness, past the body's patient insistence that something needs attention until a physical event finally becomes large enough that it cannot be explained away at all. The soul does not intend cruelty in this. It intends communication, and the body is simply the first place it reaches, before the mind is willing to hear. The body already knows. The compass inside every ship does not announce itself dramatically. It shifts a few degrees when the vessel begins to drift off course. Not an alarm, a quiet, consistent indication that adjustment is needed. If noticed early, if the navigator glances at it and corrects, the journey continues with only a minor detour. But if the compass is set aside, if the drift is explained away, if the correction is postponed and then postponed again, the ship can travel very far from its intended direction before anyone is willing to acknowledge what has happened. What would be different in your own life if you allowed what your body has already been registering quietly, persistently, to simply be heard? Not acted on immediately, not analyzed, simply acknowledged. Sometimes that small act of acknowledgement is the entire distance between a life that keeps drifting and a life that finally begins to correct. Somewhere in these first 3 chapters. Something may have recognized something in you. The tightening that happens when you try to hold on to something slipping. The flatness that has settled into something you once found genuinely alive. The signal you have been explaining away for longer than you would like to count. You do not need to have it resolved to say so. A single word in the comments is enough. The signal, or the compass, or simply, I am here. Because one of the things worth knowing in whatever you are carrying tonight is that you are not carrying it alone. And that what feels like a drift, sometimes, is simply the beginning of a correction towards something truer than where you were going. Chapter 4. What God Removes. There is a kind of loss that takes years to understand, not the kind that arrives with obvious cause, not the accident or the illness or the event that everyone around you immediately recognizes as difficult. The harder kind. The kind where you lose something that by every reasonable measure should have been sustainable, that you had invested years in preserving, that you had planned and worked and held together with careful, sustained effort. And then, through circumstances that often feel entirely outside your control, it is simply gone. The ego's response is immediate: grief. The urgent need to recover what was lost, to rebuild what collapsed, to return life as quickly as possible to the shape it had before. Because for the ego, the only acceptable response to a significant ending is to restore exactly what ended. What is harder to access, and what only becomes visible at a certain distance from the event, is a different possibility entirely. That what was removed was not taken from you, it was cleared for you. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But he was precise about the kind of pain he meant. Not suffering as punishment, not loss as evidence of failure. Pain as the specific experience of a structure that has outlived its purpose, giving way the way an old growth must fall before a new one has access to the light. Many spiritual traditions hold this understanding in a form more direct than psychology usually allows. When God closes a door, when circumstances remove something we were holding tightly, it is not always an act of absence. It is sometimes an act of guidance. The removal of what would prevent us from arriving somewhere we could not have reached while still holding what we were holding. A woman who had built her life in one city over 15 years was displaced by circumstances she did not choose. She spent the first year trying to return. Not just practically emotionally, she was rebuilding in her mind the life that had been interrupted, working backward toward the version of herself that had existed before the disruption, not building anything new. The second year was different, not because anything resolved, but because the effort to return finally exhausted itself completely. And in the space that opened, the genuine, quiet space that appears only when the forcing has used up its last reserves, she began to notice where she actually was. Not where she was trying to get back to. Where she was. She described the turning point not as a moment of insight, but as something overheard. She was in a small restaurant in the new city, at a table near two people she had never met and would never see again. And one of them said quietly to the other, "You cannot carry water in a broken cup. You have to find a new vessel." She had not been part of that conversation. It was not addressed to her. And yet she said it was the most directly she had ever felt spoken to in her life. What was removed from her life, the specific shape of the city, the relationships, the version of herself she had been, had not been taken. It had been cleared, not without cost, not without genuine grief, but cleared, so that a vessel that actually fit what she was becoming could finally be found. The hand that cleared what she was holding was not an enemy to the life she wanted. It was simply working on a longer timeline than she had access to. Chapter 5. The appointments you did not make after the clearing, after the exhaustion of trying to rebuild exactly what was lost, after the ego finally, and usually reluctantly, releases its insistence that life must return to the shape it had before. Something begins to change in the quality of what arrives. Not dramatically, in small ways, specific ways. The kind that accumulate over time into a pattern that eventually becomes very difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. A book left on a bench, open to a sentence that addresses something you had been carrying privately for months. A conversation that begins as ordinary small talk and turns into something that reorganizes the way you have been thinking about a question you had not even fully named. A door that appears quietly, without announcement in the weeks after a previous door has finally been released. Carl Jung called this synchronicity. He defined it carefully because he understood how easily the idea could slide into wishful thinking or magical reasoning. Synchronicity is not the belief that everything is meaningful. It is the recognition of a very specific quality of coincidence, one that carries significance for the particular person experiencing it at the particular moment they experience it. Not every coincidence, a specific kind. One that feels different from chance in a way that is difficult to articulate precisely, but impossible in the moment to honestly dismiss. Jung wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." The condition in that phrase is worth holding. Eyes to see. What is worth noticing about synchronicity, and what Jung observed with particular attention, is when it tends to arrive. Not randomly, not evenly distributed across all phases of a person's life. It clusters. It appears most often and most vividly in the specific period immediately after someone has genuinely released something. After a grip has truly loosened, not just been temporarily set down, but actually released something in the quality of the following weeks and months changes. It is as if the act of genuine release creates a kind of interior opening. And through that opening, things begin to arrive that the previous tight gripping had been holding out. God's timeline, if we are willing to use that language, does not correspond to the ego's schedule. The ego wants the right door to open before it closes the wrong one. It wants the replacement before the release. It wants certainty before trust. But the deeper guidance that operates through synchronicity works the other way around. It responds to genuine release, not to strategic release performed in the hope of getting something in return. Actual release, the kind that comes after the forcing has fully exhausted itself. A man who had left a position he had held for many years described the months that followed as the strangest of his professional life. Not because things went well quickly, they did not, but because of what kept arriving in the spaces between his attempts to reconstruct what had ended. He described it not as a series of obvious signs, more like a shift in frequency, as if something had been broadcasting for a long time on a channel he had been too busy to receive. And in the quieter period that followed the ending, he finally happened to be tuned to the right wavelength. Think about the difference between walking through a forest with a destination and walking through a forest without one. The forest does not change, the trees do not rearrange themselves. But what is noticed? What registers? What becomes available to perception? Changes entirely. The person with the destination sees a path. The person without one sees the forest. God, or the deeper guidance that operates through the ordinary circumstances of life, tends to arrive in what the second kind of walking makes available: in the pauses. In the unremarkable afternoons when the plan was suspended and something the ego had not arranged came through. The most important arrivals in most lives were not planned. They were received. Chapter 6. The Peace That Confirms. After everything that has been walked through tonight, there is one final thing worth naming, because it is the most reliable sign of the right direction, and the quietest, and the one most people walk past without recognizing it for what it is. It is not external success, not recognition from the right people, not the arrival of the specific outcome that was worked toward, not even the resolution of the uncertainty that has been sitting in the chest for months. It is simply this: a morning when the effort stops feeling like effort. Not because the work has become easier, not because the circumstances have simplified or the challenges have disappeared, but because something in the relationship between you and what you are doing has shifted in a way that is difficult to name precisely. A resistance that was always present, so consistently present that it had come to feel like simply the natural texture of adult life, is no longer there. Jung described what he called individuation, the lifelong journey toward becoming genuinely oneself, as the deepest work available to a human being, and he wrote of it with unusual directness. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not to achieve a particular outcome, not to arrive at a specific destination the ego selected years earlier, to become who you actually are. Which is, as anyone who has come near this experience will tell you, a very different destination from the one most people have been navigating toward. Consider two people making the same decision. Same external situation. Same information available. Same practical stakes. The first makes it from accumulated pressure, from the need to produce a specific outcome, from the anxiety of not yet knowing what the right answer is. They decide, and the decision sits in them with a quality of ongoing tension. A background monitoring that does not quite stop. A persistent need to check, to verify, to adjust, to make sure it is still going the right way. The second makes the same practical decision from a different interior place. From something that feels less like calculation and more like recognition. As if the decision had already been made at a level they are only now consciously catching up with. And once made, it sits differently, not with certainty that everything will go well, with something harder to name, a quality of not needing to check. The outer choice is identical. The inner experience is entirely different. And here is what makes this particularly important to understand and particularly easy to miss. The settled decision does not always look more impressive from outside. Often it looks less so. The people around you may not understand why you chose it. It may not have the markers the ego was hoping for, the clear logic, the obvious strategic advantage, the plan that reassures everyone that you know exactly what you are doing. The peace that accompanies it is interior, private, invisible to anyone who was not there the moment the decision stopped needing to be checked. This is why trusting the guidance of the deeper self. Trusting God requires something the ego cannot supply from its own resources. The ego can perform confidence, but it cannot manufacture this particular quality of settledness. It can only be given when the decision is genuinely right and recognized when it arrives. The simplest way to understand what this feels like, if you have not yet encountered it clearly in your own experience, is through the shoes that fit. When the shoes are even slightly wrong, You are always aware of them. A small rubbing, a tightness. You adjust your walk without noticing. You shift your weight to compensate. You manage. It costs something quietly, consistently, always costing something. When the shoes fit perfectly, you stop thinking about them almost entirely. You simply walk. When the life being lived is genuinely your own, when the forcing has stopped and the current is carrying you, rather than being rowed against a friction that was always present, disappears. And in that disappearance, many people feel, for the first time clearly, the presence of what had been guiding them all along, the current they kept rowing against, finally allowed to carry them. The peace that arrives is not the absence of difficulty. It is the confirmation, quiet, steady, unmistakable, that the life being lived is finally, in some essential way, yours. And that something was always moving you toward this, even in the moments it felt most like loss. We began with a very specific image. A person in a room, posture slightly forward, hands folded, quietly tense in the way of someone who has been holding something for a very long time without quite knowing they are holding it. That image was not chosen at random. It is the image of most of us, on most evenings, in most of the rooms of our lives, holding, planning, monitoring, managing, doing everything we were told constitutes taking life seriously. And underneath all of that, doing a quiet, persistent exhaustion that we have learned to explain as simply the cost of being an adult. We have walked together tonight through what lies beneath that exhaustion, the ego's grip that produces the fragility it was meant to prevent, the energy of the soul that withdraws when the direction being forced no longer fits what a person is actually becoming. The signals the unconscious sends gently at first, then less gently in a language the ego was never taught to read. The clearings that felt like loss and were, in fact, preparation. The arrivals that felt like coincidence and carried, in fact, the specific quality of something being offered rather than something happening by chance. And the peace, at the end of all of it, that does not arrive as triumph or resolution, that simply appears. One ordinary morning, as the absence of a friction that had been present so long, it was mistaken for the texture of life itself. Jung wrote it simply. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. Not an instruction to withdraw from the world or abandon the practical responsibilities of a life. A description of where the most important information about the direction of your specific life is actually located. Not in better plans, not in more careful management, not in the next resolution of the next difficult situation. In the willingness to turn with the same quality of attention you have been giving to everything outside of you toward the interior life, toward the quiet that opens when the forcing has finally stopped, toward the current that has been moving all along in a direction that knows something the ego does not. Many traditions call what speaks from that interior place by the name of God. Jung called it the self, and the unconscious, and the deepest center of the psyche. But what both are pointing toward is the same recognition, that there is a guidance available in the life of every person. That does not shout. That does not force. That does not send clear instructions on a schedule convenient to the ego. That simply moves in the direction of what is true and waits, and that the forcing was never the path to it. The forcing was what was preventing it. This is what Where You Begin is built on. The understanding that the search ends where it began. that the direction you have been looking for has always been present in the very place you were most reluctant to look. If this video found you at a moment when you needed it, perhaps that was not entirely by accident. Subscribe to Where You Begin, and we will continue walking inward together. Because everything you are looking for starts where you stopped looking. The hands can open now. The current knows where it is going. And so perhaps for the first time in a long time, do you